There is something about the story of John Wesley that continues to be intriguing and important for us even to today. While the world we live in doesn't look a lot like his did, in many ways it still feels a lot like his world. John Wesley, for a good part of his early life, resisted Jesus' call to follow me. Not because he didn't have faith and not because he didn't believe. Wesley was incredibly well educated. He had a deep faith, but somehow he was missing something in there. He grew up as a pastor's kid, knowing what faith meant. He was an ordained clergy person. He knew what the church was supposed to look like. So when Jesus was calling him, he thought he knew then what would happen, that he would respond to Jesus' call to follow me, and then he knew exactly what was going to take place after that because he had that experience. He knew what the church was supposed to be. But they were missing something. He was missing something. Wesley realized and he knew that something wasn't quite right with what he was doing. He knew this for a long time. This is what we see him struggle with all the time, is his inability to really deal with things until he comes to that standing outside of a preaching house on Aldersgate Street where he would hear Jesus' call to follow me again. And then he would finally, many of those pieces would fall into place, that he would start to be realized that all that he'd been educated in and ordained in, that he'd been going in the wrong direction. These changes that he would make in order to better follow Jesus would eventually get him to the right place. Where you're going to see kind of the image change behind me now, and you're looking at a lithograph of John Wesley preaching literally on the grave of his father Samuel outside of the Epworth church that he grew up in. And what's fascinating about this is that this was something that Wesley had to do, because by this point in his ministry, he had been forbidden from preaching in many Anglican churches, including the one that he grew up in, the Epworth church that was his home church. He could not preach in there, and so he did something that was different. He took a step outside, and the crowd was there with him, and he preached there on his father's grave. And he would go at the urging of friends and of others to any place that needed to hear the gospel proclaimed. And it didn't matter where it was, whether it was in a church or not in a church, that became something that was unimportant to Wesley. It was where were the people. But more so than that, Wesley didn't just preach. He listened. And he would do what he could for others to serve them as he would listen to their stories. One time preaching would take him to the coal mines of Bristol. Now we all know that coal mining, even today, is a very dangerous line of work, but we have all sorts of modern safety protocols, laws, regulations, rules, all those sorts of things that make it as safe as possible. But back in Wesley's day, it was worse. It was far worse. And so he would come to preach to the miners, many of them still covered in soot from the mines. And he would come to preach to them. In fact, there's stories of Wesley preaching, and as lives were changed due to his preaching, you could see the tear tracks running down their faces where the tears were taking off the soot as they were running down their face. For people, the coal miners who had very little hope that anything would ever be different than this incredibly hard life that they had, he gave them hope. And many came to faith because of John Wesley's preaching. But it didn't stop there. It didn't just stop, though, with the preaching. He listened to their needs and to their hopes that maybe their kids would have a better life, and so he would go to start a day school for the kids of the coal miners so they'd have some place to learn and to grow and to become more than what their parents were. Today, we might say that John Wesley had an entrepreneurial spirit. Now, that's kind of a modern thing that we would say. Wesley would never say that. What he would say is that he saw something that needed to be done, and he did it. And Wesley would do what others wouldn't. George Whitefield, who is a contemporary of John Wesley, who would eventually immigrate to the United States and become one of the great preachers of the Great Awakening in the U.S., would say of John Wesley that And it wasn't just that Wesley would preach, because Whitefield would say, well, he would preach, but Wesley did something that he didn't. Wesley would go and he wouldn't just preach to them, but he would find a way of gathering them together in groups, binding them together into communities, finding ways of meeting their needs so that they could be a community of faith. Wesley and the Methodists in England and also then in the U.S. would start schools, hospitals, universities, publishing companies. They would visit the prisons and the poorhouses. They would write books and tracts and brochures. They would teach kids. They would do anything they could that would find people and gather them together to meet their needs, so they didn't just hear the gospel being preached, but that they could experience the gospel for themselves. When Jesus says, "Follow me," this is what he's talking about. Not just the preaching, but the experiencing. Now we're going to shift our story again to another place. You see behind us now we're standing on a picture of an old fishing boat. Some guys that are there working with their fishing nets. Our scripture reading today tells the story of Jesus calling his very first disciples. Now this is a very well-worn story. And I would argue, in many ways, it's almost a worn-out story. Because if you've been a believer for any amount of time, then you know how this story goes. That Jesus sees some guys fishing. He says to them, "Come and follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Then he goes on just a little ways further, and he sees some other guys that are repairing their fishing nets with their father at the boat. And he says to them, "Follow me," and they drop their nets, and they go, and they follow him. Now, I say this is an old, worn-out story because too often we look at this story as the archetype of what it means to follow Jesus. That we should just follow immediately and without question and just go and do. And then what follows from that, though, this is the problem with this story, is that if we don't do that, then somehow we aren't good enough. That the thought is that we should be willing to drop everything and just to follow. But that's not an accessible story to us, though, is it? Because how many of us could just drop everything and go and do just like that? We struggle with parts of this story, most notably because it appears that James and John, when Jesus calls them, just drop their nets and they leave their father there to tend to everything else. How does that work with a faith that intentionally seeks to build up a community? That all of a sudden the first thing that happens is that a community is torn apart. In Jesus' call to follow, we have to remember the whole story that is taking place there. Because it's not just Jesus saying, "Follow me." Remember the first thing that Jesus does when he's talking to Simon and Andrew. He takes them as fishermen. He doesn't try to change them into being something else. He takes them as fishermen and says to them that they will continue to fish, but now they are going to be fishers of men. But more importantly in this is that Jesus says that he'll show them how to do that. That this is a learning process that they're going through. He's going to show them what that actually means, but he doesn't take them away. But he doesn't take what was them away from them. He doesn't take that fishing away from them. They are fishermen. And they're still going to be fishermen. He's just changing their direction. Jesus never tells James and John that they won't be back, that they're no longer a part of Zebedee's family. Remember all of the stories that we have in the Gospels of the disciples fishing, being on boats, of catching fish, of how important a thing that is to who they are doing. They never stop being themselves, but now they are able to do more, to be more, to build a community that grows stronger and brings others together, all because Jesus says to them, "Follow me." And then he shows them how to do it. He helps them to build that healthy muscle that makes them the healthier, better versions of themselves that they can't be on their own. And in turn, he gives them what they need so that they can meet the needs of others in their community around them, to see that community in a new way so that they can help. Whether it's through healing or preaching, teaching, miracles, or even the ability to stand up for themselves against others that would want to hold them down and keep them in their place. When Jesus says to follow me, it's these things that he is teaching, and it is this transformation that is taking place that he is making happen. And because of that, their community, their people are being changed. So let's put all this together now. What you're seeing behind me now is is called Wesley Chapel Church. It's just a few blocks away from the place where we think that John Wesley had his Aldersgate experience. And it is one of the historic churches in Methodism, one of the home churches of Methodism in England. It has a very long history. And in that you can see that there's a statue of John Wesley there. They are still holding services to this day. There's a Methodist museum that is there. And that's for me, it's really important that we see this in its place today, because there was never any doubt that Jesus was calling John Wesley, and that Jesus had said to him, "Follow me." The thing about it was that it took John a while to figure that out. That it wasn't an immediate thing for John just to follow Jesus because, hold on to that. It wasn't an immediate thing for John to follow Jesus, because John had to figure that out. Had to figure out what that meant. John had to learn what that was going to mean for him and his ministry. And it took him a while to get to that point. And so when he did that, though, then he understood what it meant. Because then what John would do was maybe one of the most surprising things that happened to him, was that he didn't just follow Jesus, but he took that next step out into something different. That he would go out and to preach into the fields or on his father's grave, or he'd go to the coal mines in Bristol, or he would go to the poorhouses, he'd go to the hospitals. He would go to where the people were, but that was just his location. His preaching I should say it this way. That was his location that changed. The desire of who he was, actually, that never changed. John Wesley's desire to reach others, all of the many other things that he would do, the ways that he would reach out, these are things that we can see him doing and trying and working to figure out long before he gets to Aldersgate. It's just at Aldersgate, it comes into a focus in a way that it never had before. When he responds to Jesus' call to follow me, John doesn't change who he is as a person, but he becomes the better version of himself as that person, able to do the things that he knows he needed to do, but he didn't quite understand before, and he can go and do them now because he's answered the call. Wesley didn't leave his family behind when he did this. In fact, he would bring his brother Charles along. Charles, who would be, and still is, one of the greatest hymn writers of all times. John's mother would come along and be an integral part of the Methodist movement. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, didn't leave their family behind either. Remember, we still see stories of them fishing and doing those things that mark them as who they are. But in that moment, when they followed Jesus, they went in a different direction in their life, even if they didn't leave everyone else behind. From that point going forward, whether we're talking about James and John or John Wesley, they were able to do more, to do differently, to better be the people that Jesus called them to be. That returned back to their community then, and to give hope to the hopeless, strength to the weak, and showed so many others that just because things had always been done and worked in one way, doesn't mean that that's where it has to stay. And then they would listen to the people around them and seek to meet their needs. We are called to the same thing. Jesus calls on each of us he says to each of us, follow me, to then become the most complete versions of ourselves, and then to really listen to what is needed around us. We live in a time with a lot of great needs, and we are positioned in just the right place in our community to meet those needs. Beth and I have had conversations on several occasions thinking about why it is that our church seems to be the first one that oftentimes gets the call, especially for folks that are just coming through town and needing help and support, why we are some of the first ones that always get that call. And actually, it's a very easy answer for that, for why that happens. The answer is that it's our location. We're the first church that folks see as you come into downtown, into the heart of our community. Our building occupies one of the more important corners in town because that is the start of where our heart is. But that's just our building. That is our location that says this is where we are. But what about us? Are we ready to respond to Jesus' call? Are we ready to listen to those needs? We've started. In so many ways, we have started that. But we also live in a time that is very different from any other time in our lifetime. Are we ready as we look towards this spring and this summer? Are we ready to help address the mental, physical, and spiritual needs of the people that are around us? And this cuts across all levels of society. It's not just one group of folks that are going to find themselves in this place, because we are all looking for a time when things will begin to return to normal. There should be big quotes around that saying return to normal, because we've been at this for long enough now that we don't really know what normal looks like. We've got folks that will be easing back into normalcy very slowly, others that are going to jump in with both feet just because they can, and most of us are going to find someplace in that middle ground. But are we ready to be a part of addressing those needs? My challenge to us is that it's time for us to start thinking, start working through what that will mean to follow Jesus in this day and in this time in a world that doesn't know really what it is. Are we ready to be that entry, that first place that people will stop, that invites others in, that helps them to overcome what they're facing, and to show them what a full and complete life in Jesus Christ looks like? One that doesn't say they need to become completely different than they are, but says to them, I can help you be the most complete version of who you are, because that is who God has made you to be. Now that sounds like a big order for us. Remember that sometimes those big things start with just one step. Remember John Wesley, when he was preaching on his father's grave, stepped outside of the church to go and to do that, just a step that he took. James and John, when they followed Jesus, they dropped their nets and they took a step forward. They didn't immediately go into becoming some of the most important of Jesus' disciples. They first just took that step to someplace different, but in a different direction. My question for us as we go from here is, what does that step look like for us? What does that step look like for you? To take that next step out and to respond to Jesus' call to follow me. This week, go and answer that question and do so in Jesus' name. Amen.